we will move forward with our last lecture of the day. Our next speaker has a master's in law and robotics and is currently a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen. Mr. Leonard van Rompuy on the legal aspects of AI in the world.
Hello. So, I've been tasked about to talk to you about the more legal perspective on autonomous weapons. Paul has been promising a lot of things about my presentation. I don't think I can deliver on all of them, unfortunately, but I'll do my best. So, firstly, I would like to look at what are the kind of problems from a legal perspective that autonomous weapons create. So there is law in warfare. It's called law of armed conflict, and it actually is part of a two-sided legal topic. It's called jus ad bellum and jus in bello, so the law to war and the law in war. The first one is basically the law of maintenance of peace and security. It's UN Security Council, the possibility to authorize conflicts, to authorize sanctions around the world. And then there is the armed conflict perspective, so laws in war. And basically laws of war were created here in The Hague. And well, the first big convention on laws of war was signed here in The Hague in 1999, the Hague Convention, and there was a second one in 1907. So already back in the time, states had realized in the early 20th century that, well, war was really horrible and that we needed to bring back some humanity in it, at least a little bit. So they created a certain number of rules, and there were the states back then that were participating in the creation of those treaties that set a certain number of principles. Then, of course, there was World War I that proved that those principles did not work in the way they were fleshed out back in the time. So they created the League of Nations that had the task to facilitate not only the laws of war, the laws in war, but also the laws to war. And the objective of the League of Nations was to create this kind of forum where states discussed questions of security and peace and trying to bring back diplomacy at a wider scale. Eventually, as you know, there was World War II, and again, most of the treaties and legal obligations and political institutions that had created completely showed failure at dealing with warfare. So after World War II, we created the United Nations with the UN Security Council that was tasked with being the only... So basically what happens in 1945 is that before that, war was legal, but it had to be done in a certain way, okay? And then League of Nations war becomes more or less illegal, but never really, that principle never really flourished. And then World War II comes, and law, it's not just war that becomes banned, it's armed conflict. So that's the logic of the current regimes we have. It's to look at armed conflict and not war per se. And you have armed conflict as soon as you have a state fighting either another state or an armed group, a non-state armed group. So that's just for the basis. And then in '49 they drafted and signed the Geneva Convention. So, what are the big principles about humanitarian law? Because that's also how we call it, humanitarian law. And how are these principles challenged by autonomy in warfare, by artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons? So there is one big principle in humanitarian law, and that's the principle of distinction. That means that in warfare, as soon as you're in armed conflict, other sets of rules do not apply anymore, or you take away constitutional rule of law and you replace it with armed conflict law, which basically puts aside a lot of democratic principles so that the state can actually survive and fight off the enemy. The first foundational principle of humanitarian law is distinction. It means that you are not allowed to target civilians. You are not allowed to target combatants that are out of combat. So that means combatants that have been wounded or that have laid down their weapons. And that's the basic principle. Do not kill civilians, do not kill combatants that have laid down their weapons, that are not fighting anymore. Because they do not represent what we call military advantage. You don't gain a military advantage according to the Geneva Convention when you kill civilians or you kill combatants that have stopped fighting. So how is this principle challenged by artificial intelligence? Where the first thing we ask is, if you send a Terminator on the battlefield, can it actually make a difference between a civilian and a combatant? Can it make a distinction between a civilian and a civilian participating actively in hostilities, which are also legal, lawful targets? And that's, of course, a problem, but I think it's more a problem from a technical perspective, is that until we actually manage to prove that the machines can do that, like they can discriminate between lawful and unlawful targets, then essentially the laws of war would prohibit the use of such weapons. Then the second principle of armed conflict, of the laws of armed conflict, is proportionality. Proportionality is basically an exception to distinction. That means, okay, you're not allowed to kill civilians, you're not allowed to kill combatants that have laid down their weapons, but if there is a very important military target for you, and that by destroying it, you really deal a hard blow to the enemy, and that allows you to end the war quicker, you are allowed to kill a proportionate amount of civilians around it. It's horribly cynical, but that's humanitarian law is basically the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict is a constant operation of balance between military necessity, so the necessity for a state to protect itself and to protect its assets, and humanitarian principles, consideration for life. So it's horribly cynical, but essentially, if you kill a tank, if you destroy a tank and there's 2 civilians around it, well, it's not allowed to target the civilians directly, but if you destroy the tank and the civilians die, then it kind of is legal, because it's proportionate. Proportionality also has an importance in looking at how much damage you deal to the enemy. For example, if you're shooting at, on the battlefield, if you're shooting at an enemy soldier, well, it's preferable to wound them rather than kill them. And it's preferable to make them hostage rather than wound them. Because it's, you have to pick basically the strategy that allows you to achieve the military objective you're trying to fulfill while remaining, while the necessity remaining proportionate to the amount of pain you inflict on the other. So how is that a problem with machines? Well, human beings on the battlefield or in other conditions have, especially soldiers, they usually get a training for that, and sometimes, of course, national training is not as good as it should be. But, well, if someone is on the battlefield shooting at someone else, they can they can know, for example, that they can shoot at the person in the leg and that will stop them rather than kill them. The same way, if you have military commanders making the decision to attack a certain military objective, they will also assess the level of proportionality of the attack. I think that's much more problematic when it comes to autonomous weapons, because proportionality is not just a mathematical equation. I mean, proportionality is a mathematical equation if you can dredge up some memories from math classes in high school. But I think it really takes a lot of very. It's hard to explain, but we can judge how much pain someone else is going to suffer, and we know what that pain means because we have experienced pain ourselves. So when human beings make decisions about proportionality, they know what they're talking about or doing. They still decide, those military commanders, to shoot nonetheless, which is, of course, not the best possible choice to make. I will agree with the previous speaker on that point. But nonetheless, humans making proportionality assessments in warfare have something that is deeply humane. There is something deeply humane about assessing what is a proportionate outcome in terms of inflicting pain and destruction on the other. And if you could find, even if the machine could find the exact mathematical equation that best tailors the different weights of different factors to make a proportional assessment, I would argue that it would always lack this deeply human element of assessing how much pain the other is feeling. So that's a much more complicated problem from a legal perspective there, because you would need to prove that the robot can be proportionate, can be used proportionately. That means it's not going to kill too many civilians, that it can be used in, for example, nuclear weapons are disproportionate by nature because they cannot make a distinction. By nature, they can't distinguish civilians and combatants, and because the impact of a nuclear bomb is so huge, it necessarily affects civilians or the environment in a way that is disproportionate. But to make robots that would be able to make those same decisions about proportionality is much more complicated, because it's not just a technical question there that we're trying to solve, it's also a question of assessing what is just and fair from a human perspective in the amount of pain we inflict on other people. Then there is the principle of precaution and Article 36 of the additional protocol number 2 to the Geneva Conventions. So the principle of precaution is just a temporal application of the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality. That means that when you're planning an attack, you have to take the precaution to assess the situation, to know exactly, to try to know exactly how many civilians are going to be impacted, what is it exactly that you're targeting. Then when you launch the attack, you have to keep precaution, you have to remain precautious to make sure that the situation on the battlefield doesn't evolve in a way that would make the attack become unlawful. And once the attack has actually reached its target, well, the soldiers on the field have to remain precautious that they're not targeting civilians, that what they're seeing is actually the mission they were set for. Article 36 is the obligation for states to conduct a legal review of new means and methods of warfare. So essentially, when you want to acquire a new type of rifle or a new type of missile, well, you have to assess whether this weapon used by your armed forces is going to be able to respect the principle of distinction and proportionality and precaution. Both those principles also cause a certain number of problems when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. Precaution may be a little bit less than Article 36. The problem with Article 36 is that when you're assessing if a machine can remain, autonomous weapons can remain proportionate and distinction, you're essentially making a decision in the future. Let me give you a little example. When the US decided to field their current drone technologies, the Reaper, basically it was just a surveillance drone. It didn't have any offensive capabilities back at the time. It was only developed to be a surveillance and reconnaissance object. But eventually they figured out that they could fit Hellfire missiles on those drones. And the thing is that the Hellfire missile, as used by fighter jets or as used by boats, had been legally reviewed as lawful by the US, and so had the Reaper been reviewed as legal for its surveillance missions. But then they said the Reaper is lawful, the Hellfire missile is lawful. If you put them together, they remain lawful, and they did not conduct a new legal review at this point. Drones are not autonomous weapons, they are piloted from far, but there is a continuous evolution between what we currently see as drones and the future of military technology, especially with AI, is that essentially we are going to give more and more autonomy to those drones or to boats and so on, so that, you know, right now, or at least when they started using drone strikes, you essentially needed 20 people to pilot a drone. And there were different teams that would relay each other all the time, but you needed 20 people to pilot one drone, because you had people, every person had a distinct mission in the piloting of the machine. Some were supposed to establish the wider consequences, some were supposed to pilot the thing, and so on. But when you have, the thing is that when you're reviewing either drones or Hellfire missiles, you know that there will still be a military general in the end that will consider, okay, can I use my Hellfire missiles to strike at this base? And they will still make an analysis at this point of proportionality, distinction, and precaution, as I mentioned before. But when you are reviewing, when you're making a legal review of autonomous weapons, you have to project yourself in the future, in the sense, in the context in which those weapons will be fielded, will they be able to make themselves those assessments of proportionality, distinction, and precaution? And that right now is causing huge problems. No one is finding a tangible solution to how you do this, because you can't just think during the legal review about every possible scenario in which the machine will be used. That's not just doable in terms of manpower and intellectual power, but still, if you want to conduct a proper legal review of autonomous weapons, that's what you should be doing. So essentially, legal reviews right now cannot be completely done for autonomous weapons. There's only about 15 countries in the world that actually do Article 36 legal reviews of autonomous weapons, including the Netherlands. But a lot, if not most, of countries in NATO, for example, do not conduct legal reviews for their weapons, even though they have signed the additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions. Let's take a look now about autonomous weapons more specifically. So, in the debates, the international debates, they're characterized as lethal autonomous weapon system laws, which is a bit comical, I think, to call them like this. Anyway, what kind of problems are raised by those different words? Lethal, to start with. It's, for example, in the UN right now, it's lethal autonomous weapons. So if you're considering a machine that is not lethal, that is sub-lethal or non-lethal weapons, then it wouldn't be considered with the current UN conversations. So that's the first problem. But when you're looking at lethal, you can also think about hyper-accuracy. Essentially, if a robot is so efficient at shooting a rifle that it can either kill the enemy combatants systematically, because it's just so good at shooting them in the head, or on the other side that's so good at shooting so very well that every time you can shoot them in only the muscle parts of the legs so that they can't walk anymore, but it actually doesn't damage either the bone structures, the ligaments, or the arteries, then you efficiently incapacitate the enemy soldiers without killing them. The thing is that this hyper-accuracy problem is an argument you can use either way. You know, for example, proponents of autonomous weapons will tell you, well, we will make robots that are just so precise that they will never kill. And then on the other side, you will have people that are arguing against autonomous weapons that will say, those weapons will be so precise that they will kill every time. Autonomous. So that the machine is making its own decision, at least when it is launched on the field. We're not planning, I don't think anyone in the world, any military, wants to make weapons that make decisions by themselves as to when they should be launched to combat. They don't want robots that take away the power from military commanders and the military command chain. But autonomy still poses a lot of problems in terms of responsibility. Essentially, you're a general, and you send a bunch of killer robots on the field, and you know they kill civilians for whatever bug or reason that was around back at the time. Can you actually consider that the general is responsible, criminally responsible for the acts of the machine, if those machines, once launched, were completely autonomous, that they were making all the decisions by themselves and there was no human control over them? Well, that poses a huge problem. And then if the general is not responsible in this case, because you know he checked all the cases, all the boxes, he made sure that it would be there would be distinction and there would be proportionality and all of this. And but still, you know, people die. And eventually, well, you know, our legal systems right now cannot make him responsible for that attack. Well, there is impunity, but then can you actually make other actors responsible for the actions of the machine? For example, the designer or the manufacturer of the autonomous weapons? That poses also other legal problems. In terms of autonomy, there is also a problem, I touched upon it earlier, about means and methods. So that's two categories we have in humanitarian law. The techniques you use for warfare are either means, that means objects, weapons, a fighter jet, a missile, Kalashnikov, or they're methods. That means they're ways of using the rifle. Essentially, when you decide to mount Hellfire missiles on a fighter jet, or that's one method, and if you decide to put them on ships, that's another method. But the problem with autonomous weapons is when you look at them, you can't really classify them as either means or weapons, as means or methods, because they're both at the same time. They're developed to be machines that have the capacity to use other weapons. In this case, they're methods. But then they're also the machine, the object, the mean itself. So there's a confusion there from a legal perspective. And some would also argue that, you know, if you look at the purely legal perspective on this, you could also say that, you know, if you look at the definition for a combatant in international humanitarian law, well, apart from 2 words or 3 words in the definition, all the other terms would actually apply to an autonomous weapons. You could essentially use the definition of a combatant to qualify an autonomous weapon, because they're making decisions on the spot, because they're part of the armed forces, and so on and so forth. Weapons, so lethal autonomous weapon systems. Weapons, I also talked about it briefly, they're platforms for other weapons as well, as much as being a weapon by themselves. You know, between the 2 Koreas, the South have developed those systems called the SGR-A1, who is a little old defense turret that's immobile and that's guarding the southern side of the DMZ, the demilitarized zones between the 2 Koreas. And those systems have 3 modes of functioning. They have one where they're able to target potential trespassers between the DMZ and warn them, and at the same time send a notice to a human operator telling them, there is someone trespassing, can I shoot at them? And then the operator has to accept. That's the first mode of functioning. The second mode of functioning of those where the machine warns the trespasser and then sends a notice to the human operator, unless you tell me otherwise, I will shoot at that person in 5, 10, 20 seconds. And then there's a third mode of functioning for those where the machine is essentially becomes completely autonomous. It will warn and fire at will. But the thing is that those SGR-A1s, well, you can put taser weapons on them just as much as you can put bazookas. They can fit either. So they're both the weapon and the platform for other weapons. And the synergy that you will have between different weapons and different platforms changes the whole end result of the machine, of the whole lethal autonomous weapon system. Yeah. And then system, I think that's more of that also encompasses previous things I've been telling about the thing being the platform for other weapons and so on. So, where are we talking about autonomous weapons right now? The main forum of discussion is called the Convention on Conventional Weapons. So it's a 1980 treaty that was signed within the UN, but it's not actually part of the UN system. It's a separate entity that is glued onto the UN. And what happened is that in 2012-2013, there was Special Rapporteur Christoph Heinz, who wrote, so he was a Special Rapporteur in front of the Human Rights Council for summary and extrajudicial executions. And he made a report pointing potential human rights violations by machines that would be making decisions to shoot or not shoot at people on the battlefield. And he was making the argument that, by essence, those would be inherently summary and arbitrary decisions. Eventually, the UN decided that the Human Rights Council was not the right forum to talk about this, so they moved the debate to the Convention on Conventional Weapons. The CCW is a disarmament, how to call it? It's basically a pick and choose treaty. It means that there is a platform for the treaty that allows the creation of protocols. Right now there are 5 protocols in the CCW, and when you join the CCW as a state, you have to pick 2 of those, but you don't have to pick the 5 of them. And then you participate in the negotiations of the next protocols. So there's a protocol for flaming weapons, for mines, which was actually adopted before the Ottawa Mine Ban Convention, but it was a total failure, that anti-mine protocol, because basically the scope of the protocol was so restricted that, well, states that had signed could still keep on using mines. There's a protocol on explosive remnants of war. So that's, you know, basically bombs and shells from World War II. That's still a big problem in Europe right now. And then there's the 4th protocol, which is the blinding laser weapons. So that's a more interesting protocol for our autonomous weapons perspective. How much time do I have altogether? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. And blinding laser weapons is basically in the mid-2000s, the USA and China had developed prototypes for blinding laser weapons that were basically able, within 1 second, to permanently blind human beings in a target of, like, I think, 100 meters or something, you know. It was extremely effective. It completely burned out the eyes of the people and making them completely blind. Hopefully, the international community decided to completely ban those weapons, and the United States and China both agreed to sign this thing. And it's particularly because of this protocol on blinding laser weapons that the UN and the states decided the CCW was the right forum, is that they saw that piece of technology, blinding laser weapons, that had been effectively tackled by the forum, and that was the rationale for putting the autonomous weapons discussions there. Yeah, so since 2014, they have been making meeting of experts every year at the UN, where basically a bunch of scholars from technical, legal, ethical, and strategic backgrounds would come and discuss the issue, talking about the possibilities of artificial intelligence, the strategic interest for developing those weapons. And they've been talking about since. Last year they finally moved into a more concrete forum called a Group of Governmental Experts on Autonomous Weapons, where they actually started negotiating on the topic, because you know, those meeting of experts was no negotiations. They had discussions, they had expert presentations, but there wasn't any tangible political or legal outcome to those conferences. But now they moved on to the next step. So, this UN CCW forum is completely failing at tackling the autonomous weapons problem, in my opinion. There is a lack of political consensus to start with. States that have the capacity to develop autonomous weapons have been using a lot of dilatory maneuvers to slow down the debates and make them go in irrelevant perspective, just because they wanted to talk about the subject without really talking about the issues. I'm looking at you, France, and the United Kingdom, especially. The US is actually more open about their use and their intents on autonomous weapons than other interested states like South Korea, Japan, Israel, the Netherlands, and France, and the UK. There's also political strategies involved in those by states like Mexico, Cuba, or Pakistan that are using those CCW talks as only a way to get back at the United States or other countries, which also kind of doesn't really help have efficient and productive conversations on the topic. There is also the interest for media exposure for a lot of NGOs. I'm thinking about, for example, there is this thing called the Campaign Against Killer Robots that organizes the resistance against the autonomous weapons, which includes Human Rights Watch for its biggest partner. And those campaigns and NGOs tend to make arguments about apocalyptic AI and really use, in my opinion, really use those forums as a way to bring media exposure by making really irrelevant claims onto on the topic, I think. So that's also slowing down it's not really bringing a real earnest debate on autonomous weapons. There's, I think, not enough technological progress right now to be talking about autonomous weapons in earnest, because, I mean, yeah, there's ACE-GR A1 and there's the Harpy missile by Israel, but it's not really a widespread technology. There's really not that much research actually done on the topic, because a lot of the armament industry doesn't want to get in on developing those before they have clear outlook on legal outcomes and political will to develop those. They're not like blinding laser weapons in this case, because we don't have, you know, the clear prototype for autonomous weapons. There's a lot of legal roadblocks that are put in the way. For example, the exclusion of human rights, as I mentioned earlier, they've decided to take it out of the way, so that means that in those debates we can't talk about enforcement, we can only talk about armed conflict. And that legal definition really completely cancels a lot of relevant considerations for autonomous weapons. The thing is that for some states at least, as soon as you have armed conflict, you do not apply human rights anymore. Human rights is not the relevant regime for armed conflict. The only relevant legal regime for armed conflict is humanitarian law. And they argue this because they say humanitarian law is a subset a specialized subset part of human rights that applies when there is armed conflict, which suggests that when humanitarian law applies, human rights don't anymore. Of course, that's also a strategy not to consider relevant considerations on dignity, the right to life, and so on. So what is the main, I think, one of the main reasons why those talks, at least from a legal perspective, are not going anywhere when it comes to autonomous weapons, is because the way we are portraying autonomous weapons, at least in those forums, is as monolithic, individualized entities. We're basically looking at the human soldier we are going to replace on the battlefield. And so people have this image that until we actually have, one walking robot, we don't have an autonomous weapon, and they're not considering that, autonomous weapons are actually going to be an Internet of Things. They're going to be multiple technologies in many different fields, both military and civilians, that are going to collaborate with different levels of artificial intelligence, of different levels of autonomy, different levels of human input, in a whole network that will have both human and machine nodes, civilian and military ones, armed and non-armed technologies. So when you're talking about lethal, autonomous weapons systems, you're really looking at, that individualized Terminator on the robot, whereas what is much more relevant, and that is already happening, is Skynet. Not the super intelligent Skynet, but the network Skynet of many technologies. Satellites, and there was a few of the images of Polish that hinted at this network of technologies coalescing in one big network. And in the end, in that network, even if you have an autonomous weapon who is in the loop, as they call it, that means that there is actually a human operator that is accepting the decision of the robot to shoot, then those people, unless, even when you have that human operator making that end decision, in the end action of the robot on the battlefield are constrained by all the technological elements behind it. So in some sense, the robot on the battlefield is not autonomous, but the whole network behind it shows advanced intelligence and a lot of elements of autonomy. And I think that if we refocus on this vision of considering all the different technological nodes behind the killer robots and not just the lethal autonomous weapon one, then we can move those conversations forward to understand whether they're lethal, they're legal or illegal, and everything else. Yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Now if you have questions, I'm going to ask everyone to keep it short and concise, straight to the point with the question. Please.
Well, thank you for the explanation. I would like to question you about the fact that we have primarily spoken about conventional warfare being enhanced by AI in the actual battlefield.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Well, primarily speaking about killer robots. Is this better?
Yeah, it is.
However, currently there are also a lot of developments going on, for instance, within the realm of cybersecurity or digital attacks. And I could imagine that one could use an AI as a weapon system to disrupt enemy communications, disrupt their energy or electricity networks, which technically do not really inflict damage on a person or a civilian, but indirectly could cause a lot of damage.
Sorry, I really didn't get it. I'm having a lot of trouble understanding what comes out of the speaker.
All right.
Try to have the mic and speak up a bit.
Maybe you could try to rephrase it.
Sure. There is a lot of talk about killer robots on the conventional battlefield, being more accurate weapon systems, shooting, killing people. However, due to the communications, electricity networks, etc., to deprive him of all the means of actually waging a war, therefore winning the war, without inflicting any harm on the civilians or soldiers directly. However, by enabling such methods, indirectly the country are in turmoil because none of their essential infrastructure is working anymore, causing a lot of deaths and victims in return. However, that wasn't inflicted by my weapon system directly.
Both direct and indirect consequences in the case of an attack have to be weighed in by a military officer. So they couldn't argue that, oh, we couldn't foresee that destroying your economy would, bring everyone down in the country. That's not an argument they could make. But it's definitely a relevant point to consider the cyber elements in artificial intelligence and autonomous warfare. Just because it's easier to develop an artificial intelligence with a high degree of operability, like in Dota, for example. It's easy to make an artificial intelligence in Dota because Dota is a computer program. It's evolving in the digital world. So if you create a digital entity, an AI entity evolving in the digital world, then it's easier to, have it do what you want to do. So it's definitely a very relevant concern to think about the power of cyber attacks by autonomous capacities. But the thing is that, as I mentioned, both direct and indirect consequences have to be taken into account by military commanders and political commanders when they're deciding to launch those attacks. I don't know if this is answering your question.
Thanks, Leonard. That was really cool. If somebody believes that their rights under these laws have been violated, what can they do about it?
So there's a lot of ways of action. For example, you know that for cases of illegal, unlawful attacks in Afghanistan, some claims have been taken to the European Courts of Human Rights against those countries. Eventually, that court decided it didn't have competence over those things, but it's still a possibility. If the thing is that states have to translate into national law and national procedures the obligations from international humanitarian law. So that means that technically, within the country, you could use its judicial system to contest those decisions. So that's the type of actions. And then there's, of course, the International Criminal Court, that's also based in The Hague, for the states that have signed the treaty recognizing its existence. Then people in those states can make claims to the ICC saying that, horrible crimes of war have been committed. So that's the type of legal action we can take.
So I have both a comment and a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So the comment is that AI is a good example of something called dual-use technology, which is essentially technology that has both a military purpose as well as a civilian purpose. Missile technology in the 50s is a really good example. You can use it for peaceful exploration of space, and you can also use it to drop a nuke on your enemy. By the same token, technologies like reparation satellites in orbit could be used to repair your satellites, or to alternatively use your little hammer to destroy other people's satellites. So these things are quite complicated. And with that in mind, you also alluded to how complicated it actually is to set the parameters of any legal agreement on AI. So is there any legal basis to just say, screw it, outright ban all AI weapons, just flat out? Is that a legal strategy that is alive? Is it possible? Would that be a good idea? And is it even tenable?
Yeah, it's definitely a legal strategy that some states are promoting. For example, Vatican, Cuba, Pakistan, no, not Pakistan anymore. But some states are advocating for a total preemptive ban of the technology. The thing is that legal problems with making a preemptive ban is that just like, that mine ban convention protocol I just mentioned, you can make it void. You can basically turn it around in a way that says, oh, mine are completely illegal, and then, you still find a leeway around it to keep on using them. And the problem with AI being a general purpose technology is that to effectively constrain the types of technology that will be used, that can be targeted by this preemptive ban is going to be extremely complicated. First because it's a general technology, and also because it's a technology that's going to keep on evolving. So ways to preemptively ban autonomous weapons would be better suited making a ban on methods of warfare rather than on autonomous weapons. Like, your states have to know exactly to what extent your human operators are influenced by the networks behind them. And then if you go over that type of influence, you can't use it. Or, for example, the EU GDPR, the European Union General Data Protection Regulation that just got out. Well, of course it's a civilian element, but it shows a lot of promising elements in controlling the type of data that can be used to train those AI, because you need data to train autonomous weapons as well. So there's ways to make it harder. States don't want to do that because they don't want to constrain their technological capacities. And I would say that all the states that have the capacity of making AI weapons, or AI in general, will really try to slow things down on a general ban, also because they're afraid that their civilian technology could get left behind in the process. So it's very complicated to reach that.
I was just wondering if the focus on ITAL isn't perhaps too limiting in the scope of using autonomous vehicle systems, as when we use it, we have conflicts for interstate purposes, ITALs, when there are with a conflict between two states, whereas the wars or the conflicts most prevalent right now are non-international armed conflicts. So now we're focusing on IHL, which applies when there are states involved, whereas when there are not states involved, which are the wars which are happening now and more often, IHL doesn't even apply.
IHL applies to non-international armed conflicts. It's one of the protocols of the Geneva Conventions. The thing is that not every state has signed them.
Yes. So shouldn't the discussion be widened?
Well, I think that non-international armed conflicts are being considered in those discussions about autonomous weapons. So people are considering that issue. It's not being left out, I would say. But it's definitely a relevant consideration to have, of course.
Referring to the example Mr. Thorpe gave earlier about the young lady who died from the self-driving car. So in your perspective, who do you think should be held accountable for that murder, so to speak?
Well, for autonomous vehicles, it's a bit complicated because there's different levels of autonomy in a vehicle. And usually in that field, they make a difference in 5 levels. 5 being there is no active or passive input of the human operator in the behavior of the vehicle. So that means that you basically just type in where you want to go, and then you can lay back and have a little nap. And then in the first levels of autonomy of the car, then it's very limited to certain scopes. So that will definitely depend. In the case of the Uber car, technically there was a human operator that was supposed to be able to take back control of the vehicle in case that it wasn't making the right decision. In this case, the human operator, well, just didn't pay attention enough to see that coming. So from a purely legal perspective, he would be responsible for this. But then you could also say that Uber, to some extent, has a certain responsibility in allowing their employees to use those or selling those types of products to people that will then be using. So the thing is that as soon as you have AI, in terms of responsibility, it becomes much harder to attribute definitive and total responsibility to one actor. The legal responsibility and liability becomes divided between different actors in different ways, and it kind of dissolves in a magma of legal links that are very hard to untie from one another. And that's another problem in terms of attributing responsibility for the actions of autonomous systems in general, not just autonomous weapons.
I wanted to know that you mentioned that the lethal autonomous system talks as they are right now are too broad, and that you would like to be more specific. Which topic would you specifically want them to address first, and why?
Sorry, your question is that which topic should be addressed first in the things right now? Because no, my argument was not that we should restrict the talks. I think that no, my argument is that we should widen the talks about autonomous weapons. Quite the opposite. Because right now we're having this very simplistic and defined view of autonomous weapons as little human soldiers that have individualized entities, whereas there basically be a big networks of machines communicating with one another. It's going to be more of a one brain, many entities thing than anything else. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I misunderstood, but then I have a follow-up question. Do you think the international order can address it in a more broad perspective?
Do the international what? Sorry?
Order, just...
Well, I think they should change their perspective on their talks about autonomous weapons. I think that they should keep, of course, that humanitarian perspective, but they should also widen human rights considerations within those talks, maybe in creating different conferences. So definitely they should widen things up and all.